Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on tips and best practices for storing your vehicle long term. Leaving your vehicle sitting for weeks, months, or years on end can actually be a lot more damaging and put a lot more wear and tear on your vehicle as compared to simply driving it for 10 to 15 minutes on a weekly basis. So if you are planning to store your car for the long term, it is very important to be aware of some things before storing that vehicle to ensure that everything does stay in good, healthy condition while the vehicle is sitting. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into some of the best practices for storing a vehicle for the longer term. Number one on the list, we have thoroughly washing the interior and exterior of the vehicle. Any kind of dirt, debris, mud, or other foreign material on the paint of your vehicle in the engine bay or in the interior can really promote a number of different things, including damage to the paint, as well as making it more likely for any pests or rodents to come around the vehicle or potentially enter the engine bay or into the exhaust or anything like that. So ultimately, before storing your vehicle, it's a good idea to go ahead and thoroughly wash the car, not only the exterior, but also go ahead and get that interior cleaned out. Very simple step and something that can help really protect your vehicle and ensure that it is safe while stored. Moving on to our second tip, we have changing the engine oil. This is something that can be skipped if you're really only storing the car for a few weeks or maybe 2 months at a time. It isn't always necessary to change that engine oil, especially if your engine oil is only a few months old in the first place. However, if you do have older engine oil and or you're planning to store the vehicle for 6 to 12 plus months, go ahead and change that oil. Having fresh oil in the engine will help prevent any sludge or really buildup of gunk. So great idea to go ahead and change that engine oil again, especially if it's already older and potentially contaminated and you are planning on storing that vehicle for more than a few months. Moving on to item number 3 on the list, maintain your battery. So there are a couple different ways to do that. The best way, especially if you're truly storing it for the long term, is go ahead and purchase a trickle charger and use a trickle charger to keep that battery constantly charged. If it's maybe only a few weeks or a month or two, you can just disconnect the battery to prevent any parasitic loss while the battery is sitting. Still not as bulletproof or foolproof as simply using a trickle charger, but disconnecting the battery can be a good option. Otherwise, go ahead and get that trickle charger, keep the battery charged and healthy for the longer term. Moving on to our fourth best practice, don't use the parking brake. So the parking brake can actually lock up and potentially cause damage and issues with your braking system if you do leave that parking brake engaged for too long. So if you are planning on leaving that vehicle in storage or just sitting for a few months without driving it, ensure that you don't have the parking brake on, since again, that can cause a number of issues. Very simple thing, but something that can often be overlooked, and people just, especially on a manual vehicle, might just pull the handbrake out of habit. However, in that case, especially if you're on a flat surface, it would just be best to go ahead and make sure you leave the vehicle in gear and don't engage that parking brake. Moving on to our fifth best practice, we have use a lift or jack stands if possible. This ties a little bit into not using the handbrake or the parking brake, and especially on a manual transmission car, it is a good idea to use a lift or jack stands, especially in that kind of scenario, prevent the car from rolling or moving around anywhere. And on top of that, keeping the vehicle lifted up can actually allow you to remove the wheels and tires and store those in a cooler, drier place away from any potential direct sunlight. Also, taking the weight off of the tires removes a chance of getting any flat spots on the tires. So this is something good to do if the vehicle is going to be sitting for a month or longer. So again, if possible, use a jack and use stands or a lift if you have access to a car lift or that type of storage facility. Ultimately, lifting that car up in the air is going to make it better for long-term storage. Moving on to number 6, use a car cover. Whether or not you're parking the vehicle in a open space, a covered space, or a totally closed off space like a garage or a storage unit, it's still a good idea to use a car cover. It just gives you that extra layer of protection against any bugs, pests, rodents, etc. and could also help keep the car clean, help keep away any sunlight or really any outside elements with that car cover on the vehicle. So a good tip if you're going to store that car again, especially for a couple months or longer, go ahead and pick up a car cover and use that. It's just important to make sure before you put that car cover on that the car is cleaned. That way you're not trapping a bunch of dirt, debris, and other potential contaminants underneath the car cover. So make sure you do that after the vehicle is cleaned and detailed on the exterior. Moving on to tip number 7, store your vehicle in a cool, covered, or totally enclosed space. Again, this ties a little bit into what I discussed with the car cover. The more you can avoid any outside elements with the vehicle, the better. So any coverage or any form of protection is better than nothing. So it might be a covered parking spot or a garage or a storage facility would be ideal in that situation, but even a covered spot is better than just leaving it sitting out in a driveway or sitting out in a grass field or something like that for months at a time. Now, one tip here is if you do park it out in the open, try to park on a tarp if you can. That will prevent any grass or weeds from really growing up into the engine bay and potentially suspension components, so on and so forth. So again, the more protection, the better, but that depends on what you may have available for storage space. Moving on to our 8th and final tip and best practice for storing your vehicle long term, make sure your fuel tank is low on gas. You don't want to leave it with absolutely no gas in the tank, and also use a fuel stabilizer. Some people, especially back in the old days, would recommend actually topping up the gas tank before storing it for the long term. This generally isn't required on modern vehicles, especially a lot of 1990s or 2000s and up vehicles. You can just leave a little bit of gas in the tank, and often that's a lot easier because gasoline does only last about 3 to 6 months. So if you fill it up and leave your car sitting for 4 or 5 months, you probably want to go ahead and drain that gasoline or get it out of the tank as quickly as possible. So leaving the vehicle lower on gas means that you're wasting less gasoline, or if it might still be good fuel if you stored the car for 3 months, you can quickly drive around for 20, 30 miles, burn off as much of that gas as possible, and just go ahead and fill back up as normal once you're driving the vehicle around again. So ultimately, again, I would recommend low gas, not completely empty, leave a few gallons in there and use a fuel stabilizer. So with all of those tips and tricks out of the way, when should you really use each one of these steps? A lot of that does depend on whether you're storing the vehicle for weeks, months, or years at a time. If you're just storing it for weeks at a time, you likely won't need to keep up with some things like changing the oil. You might not need a trickle charger, however, it's still a good idea to use one even if the vehicle's just sitting for a week or two. But ultimately, the longer you're leaving your car sitting and not driving, the more of these precautionary steps you want to take to ensure when it is time to bring the vehicle out and drive it again that it is in the best possible shape and that everything is healthy and ready to go. As a final note, if you do have access to the car and it is drivable and you can take it out for a quick 10 or 15 minute spin, maybe you don't want to use the car very much, but it can go a long way just to take your car out once a week or once every other week and just take it for a 15-minute drive, let it get up to operating temperature, keep it moving around. Again, you'll still want to do all of the basics and basic maintenance and keeping up on things. Anyway, guys, that wraps up our video for today. If you appreciated the content, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more in the future. Thanks, everyone.